got to start off with the news that came down on Friday afternoon, close to Friday night, that Texas A&M baseball head coach Micheal Earley will return for the 26th season. You and I both discussed this last week that, it was really up in the air, 50-50 on whether athletic director Trev Alberts would go with him for another season, knowing that, he's a younger coach. His buyout was only about $3 million. It would have been an easy firing in terms of, financials for any program to just move on from what was always seen as, kind of a risk either way, that they felt risk reward type situation. And we did know that during the SEC meetings down in Destin, Florida, Trev Alberts was asked about this, his opinion, what's going on. Have you made a decision or not? Very cryptic, very businesslike in stating that he was going to evaluate Early's resume and what he did in his first season. And, we all know that when you look back at the season at large of the early struggles in conference play, the lack of consistent offense, stars like Jace Levelette struggling, and then this team kind of caught fire, beating Tennessee, Arkansas, LSU, South Carolina, then LSU, and then losing a home series to Missouri, getting swept by a team that was considered one of the worst teams in college baseball, especially in the SEC, who didn't win another conference game after sweeping A&M. And even though A&M won 2 games in the SEC tournament, Jace Levelette played with a broken hand, heroic, all that good stuff, losing to LSU, who is off to the Super Regionals, one of the few, we can get into that later, one of the few SEC teams who actually made it to the Super Regional round, which is surprising. You always look back and go, that Missouri sweep, which basically ended A&M's season for the worse and prevented this team from making it back to the NCAA tournament since 2006. I believe that was the last year they didn't make it. It was all bad. And it's when you're grading a head coach, and especially what I just prefaced at the beginning of the show is that, it would be cheap to fire him. And so you could just move on, try to get a bigger name, kind of a little Mississippi State gig, getting Brian O'Connell from Virginia, which was obviously one of the more veteran head coaches with championship background. But again, I went on a little bit of a diatribe last week, basically just saying that I thought bringing him back was not a huge mistake, and that you're going to take lumps in your first year. There are going to be weird losses. There are going to be things that happen, and there are going to be injuries, especially to some of the top players they have. One of those names is Gavin Grahovic, who is coming back. And he was injured early in the season. Guys like, most of the pitching staff, I would say guys like Shane Sadeo, for example, that also missed the season, that was going to be a part of that starting rotation and obviously bullpen rotation. And that, I think that killed them, especially late. But knowing that guys like Grahovic, Terrence Keel, Bear Harrison, some of the younger pitchers like Clayton Freshcorn, Gavin Lyons, Caden McCoy, all these young arms are going to come back next season, which is a big deal because, if they're going to develop these guys to turn them into starters or key bullpen rotational guys, then you have a good foundation, but you have to obviously return the rest of your team, plus really make make a lot of progress in the transfer portal. Anyways, talking too much here. I'm going to get you in on your opinion. Did you think that this was the right choice? Did you think that maybe Alberts was looking at this more like a financial decision, or was this more of give this guy a second chance to really prove his worth in College Station?
I think since last year when Alberts first came in, it was more of that business aspect. Like, how am I going to adjust for revenue sharing coming for all of our athletic programs with how it's dictated by a third party, which is going to be very tough to kind of predict before it happens, but it's his job to figure that out. So I think after a year on the job and Early being his first hire, I think that if you were in his position, I think more likely than not, you were kind of leaning already towards keeping him, because the stance of a lot of people was, hey, why are you putting a first-year head coach in that position in the first place? With all the national media saying, hey, you're ranked number 1 going into it, people were saying it was a consensus number 1. And depending on the coaching, whatever it could have been different. I know there have been some coaching changes so far with the fielding, but when you look at it from Albert's point of view, you have to make a decision not only for the business part of it, but for the athletics and just the fans' perspective as an entirety. So I think this decision was made not only financially, but in the minds of the fans as well. And trying to see if you can have that belief where another year in the same system with these people who want to play for him. I know that was a whole thing of contention this whole past season was why did we hire Early if it was just to get our players back instead of building for our future? Well, they hired Early after a couple of other like very well qualified people probably interviewed for the job or were asked about it. So it wasn't necessarily a hey, we're going with this guy because we want to keep all of our players. They went with this guy because they believe when they first hired them that he could just take off, especially after what A&M had done in that World Series so far, making it all the way to the final couple of games. Now, with all that bad blood after, you definitely were trying to entice your players to stay. But when it came together that Micheal Earley was a candidate for that job, a lot of people, myself included, were saying, hey, this is probably the right way to go about this. Your players do come back. You're giving a guy who knows these people, knows exactly what they need, and knows the steps he's willing to take those steps to get the success. So my personal take is that like Albert's made the right decision in bringing him back. And that may be the unpopular take with a couple of people. It's just how I personally view it. These players, they love him. Not only do they love him, they know he can coach. That's why they love him, is because he actively tries to make them better. And it's really, really hard to gauge that from a fan's perspective on, hey, these games aren't going their way whatsoever. But is he actively trying to make them better and learn from the mistakes that they've made from this past season, now moving forward, now that he's confirmed coming back?
Yeah, and your point is perfect there. It's both. It's something that you can't really know where his head was. I mean, Albert's, there's theories I've seen around from people who are very smart, who maybe they kind of look at Alberts as the financial fixer guy. Is that why he was brought in? Because of when former Texas A&M head football coach Jimbo Fisher was fired, all the financials having to do with his excessive $70+ million buyout. We've seen how much this school has had to pay to Fisher over the years and all their expenses. It's one of the probably the highest in the SEC by a large number. And, they kind of see it as, well, if they didn't have to deal with that, then maybe they would have moved on from Early and just went out and got a bigger coach and not had to worry about paying him a large salary. Look, if you want to live in that theory land, that's fine. If you want to think that's the reason, that's fine. And if you want to be very cautiously optimistic going into the 2026 baseball season, that's also fine. That's actually a good thing to do. You can't, because we call it out there sunshine pumping, which, a lot of media outlets have been accused of doing. I personally don't do this with, as my position as lead writer at Aggies Wire. We don't do that because it's a sense of lying, because when you go into any off season, whether it's football, baseball, basketball, you don't want to sit there and go, well, they're going to do this. They're going to improve. We don't know what's going to happen. So you can only say, well, because of what they have on the roster, or who, the coach's experience, his analytics, his approaches, all those type of things, how he trains in the offseason with his team, etc. Those things need to be taken into account when you're judging how a team is going to potentially perform. And we're now in, the most important part of the offseason for Micheal Earley is that going into the transfer portal, which opened on Monday, A&M has now lost 8 players. I would, no offense to any of those guys, but the only really notable one that stuck out to me was Nathan Tobin. He is one of the more kind of up and coming utility versatile guys that could have played a role next season. But a lot of these other guys are pitchers that just didn't see play time. They want to move on. Kyron LeBlanc is another big arm that, just could never see the field this season. He's just going to probably go maybe somewhere closer to home or go somewhere where, he can play going into next season, see time. But as we said before, they've already heard from a number of very important players that they're coming back. I always thought that the first day on Friday, it was like Friday night when Gavin Grahovic and Terrence Keele announced they were coming back. I said, well, this is going to spur a lot of guys like Caden Kent, like Ben Royo, who maybe are mulling the MLB, maybe talking to people of like, is it a good decision to enter? Is it, dipping my toe in the water? Do I want to hear from scouts what they think? Do I need to come back next season to develop? And that leads us into Jace Lavalette, who I was having a discussion with somebody the other day about this, is that like Ryan Prager, for example, A&M's ace pitcher, it's assumed that he's going to go to the MLB because he came back this season after being drafted in the third round with the 81st overall pick by the Los Angeles Angels, chose that, I can even better my draft stock this season. Well, in MLB.com's latest draft rankings, Ryan Prager isn't in there. Who is in there is Justin Lampkin, who could end up making some money. I always thought he was a candidate to come back next season. Now we could maybe switch out Prager and Lampkin, see Lampkin leave, and maybe Prager actually come back for a final year to, solve the issues that he had this season. Because, MLB teams are maybe looking at him now and going, you know what, I wouldn't waste a high draft pick on him. Maybe, with his rights with the Angels, how that works is, maybe they just don't see him as a guy that's going to develop as quickly as they thought. And one more college year, especially with a guy in Early who he loves. And, he's already developed, obviously, a chemistry pitching coach, Jason Kelly. Now we don't know if Jason Kelly is going to stay going into next season. We don't know any of that with the staff, especially we can get into that about hitting coach Caleb Longley, who I believe they should move on from, being that A&M's, hitting percentage was horrid last season. But either way, this is very important for him to not only get big-time players, especially replacing guys like Wyatt Hensler, whose eligibility is out. You're already losing a star hitter, and you're probably going to lose a guy like Jace Lavalette, who is ranked, I think it was MLB.com's, he was 15th overall, which pretty much, in my opinion, means he's going to be gone. So there's a lot you have to replace, and there are guys that maybe you think could take that next step. But right now, Gavin Grahovic, Terrence Keele, and Bear Harrison kind of represent the biggest returnees right now, and we'll see what they're going to do. But in your opinion, how should his approach be in the portal? Should it be, in my opinion, is you have to go after pitchers first. You have to solidify your pitching staff. Then you go after some of the bigger names that can help your offense improve.
I think you're absolutely correct. I think you try to go to that pitching mound first when you go into this portal. Since it opened, we've seen a lot of star players and pitchers from other schools already enter, and it's already been 28 hours since it opened, something along those lines, and it goes all the way till July 1st. So once we get well into the World Series area where all these teams are getting knocked out and their players are entering in, I'm not going to say it's a little bit of a gift to be out of the World Series, because that's the wrong mentality to look at it. But now you are able to have a full off season to assess and build again. You have a couple of pieces already, like we said, that are already returning with Gavin Grahovic, Terrence Keele. You do have some draft risks. Like we said, we've had a couple of people, even MLB.com, have all these mock drafts. I know even a couple that I saw Shane Sadeo on for an MLB flight risk. But you should probably, in my mind, target those left-handed pitchers first. Once they enter, you really want at least one or two for getting those hitting matchups to try and backfill, because you do lose guys like Kyron LeBlanc, who I was pretty high on when A&M had him in the bullpen, because he had a massive arm. I mean, you could see it on his own tape. And granted, I haven't watched that much, but the stuff that I have seen from LeBlanc, I think that wherever he goes, he's probably going to get a lot of time to show how good he actually is. And of course, Nathan Tobin, like you said, could have seen a lot more time had he probably come back. So the next order is try to get those honestly star outfielders. You're losing Jace Laviolette out there. I know you're getting Grahovic back, but the main storyline I'm looking at right now is if an official announcement is made from Caden Sorrell. Caden Sorrell is probably the one I'm looking at where, and forgive me if I'm wrong, he has not made an announcement yet, has he?
No, he is not announced yet. It's assumed right now. That was the thing. It's an assumption because his draft stock obviously goes into the next cycle. He's working towards being a top 5 pick in the 2026 draft. Because right now it wouldn't make sense for me for a guy like Sorrell to leave and transfer. I think that would only be a risk if Early was not retained. I think when you hear from the rest of the guys who have announced it, there is a trend there of they're coming back, not just because they're allegiance to Texas A&M, knowing that this was just a down year and they can improve. It's that Early being retained was a huge deal, that they were all going to come back, except for, and again, the 8 players that enter the portal. These are not names that even Aggie fans really know. There's a lot of, like Austin Vargas, for an example, is that if I asked the average Texas A&M fan who is Austin Vargas, I guarantee a lot would go, well, I don't really know who that is. And that's no offense to him. That's just baseball. There's a lot of players, and in the 2025 recruiting class, Early's done a good job, but they're landing a lot of pitchers, a lot of young arms, which are not going to make an immediate impact going into next season. So, like you said, you got to fill out, but you got to get veteran arms like you did with Miles Patton last season to even solidify your starting unit, because you just don't know what that's going to look like either, because Prater could easily leave. Justin Lampkin could now leave. And like you said, yeah, Shane Sadeo, I think it was like 110th and 113th overall that both Lampkin and Sadeo were ranked. And that's not surprising, because what we saw in the 24 season, Sadeo, I'm going to be honest, if him and Braden Montgomery did not get hurt, we're talking about A&M probably bringing home a championship during that season, because they were just so important to that lineup. And when both of them are gone, yes, A&M made it and were only a couple outs and runs away from winning the entire thing, but taking those 2 star players away really hindered their performance. But yeah, it's an interesting time, because Early is going to be judged solely on what he does this offseason, because if they go in with an average roster, I don't see this team really being one of the best in college baseball. I could see them being as we call it, a try-hard team that possibly, does well enough and pulls off some upsets to maybe get an NCAA tournament berth. But in today's college football world, college baseball world, like college football and college basketball, as we've been talking about with Bucky McMillan and obviously Mike Elko, is that if you finish with 7 or 8 wins, you don't reach the college football playoff, you start completely changing your roster. You try to bring the important players back, but you got to get talent. You got to get immediate starting talent to contend, because you can't just wait around and wait for guys to develop anymore. That used to be the case, but now that's just not it, because that the LSUs of the world and the Tennessees and even Alabama and others are going to get the best players in the portal. And Texas, after their hilarious upset loss, I'm sorry, I guarantee anybody can join in the fun with that, to UTSA, who you look at the money and the resources compared to a Texas Longhorns program. Yeah, it's completely in a different world, but their shocking loss is going.
Yeah, if I had to kind of go off on a quick tangent, if you're looking at who the players have already entered the portal from other teams like pitchers, is there one name that kind of sticks out for you where you could see Early and his staff kind of take a look at them? I know there have been a couple of right-hand pitchers, maybe a left-hander, if I'm not mistaken.
You'd actually have to answer that one, because I've been looking mainly at the outfield right now. The pitching to me has not been the additions has not been substantial yet. I do think that, like you said, when some of the super regional teams get out, I think we'll see bigger names come out. Right now, I think it's just so early that we're going to start seeing even more guys enter their name. And I think that's when Early, probably later in the week, is really going to start doing his homework on these guys. But A&M has a type. they also do believe in guys like Clayton Freshcorn and Gavin Lyons. Gavin Lyons, for example, had 10 appearances this season. He was the number 1 ranked player in Connecticut. He's entering his second season with experience. He does have stuff. He's got a lot of velocity, and he is a pitcher who I could see seeing an uptick in his play time and possibly be a more reliable arm. So there are guys they already have that they're going to be looking at. But again, the strategy, I think we'll see and understand it more going into the month. Obviously, on my own end, I'm getting bogged down by a lot of recruiting stuff with football.
Right. June official visit season is upon us.
Yeah, you got to condense it, but it's going to be interesting because we haven't seen Early do anything in the transfer portal because he became head coach late in the year. And,
right.
That Jim Schlossnagle had left in, I believe it was late June, early July. They made the hire later, and then you had to start the season pretty much with the team you had because they were all returning, plus some young guys from recruiting. They lost some guys that went to Texas, and you just kind of had the veteran team you had. So he doesn't have a track record yet. So that's why I can't really say that right now, what they're interested in. But like you said, probably focused on left-handed guys that are, have a couple years in the college ranks that, are reliable, that where you can test them out in the bullpen. And if you do lose your starters, you can really evaluate them in the offseason and set your lineup without having to just throw guys in there. Because if they don't get those guys, you will see Gavin Lyons potentially being a starter next season, which is not good. Which is not a good thing.
Yeah,
not against Gavin Lyons, but that's the type of risk you have when you don't have, for example, what Texas did. What Texas did with Max Wiener, their pitching coach, following Schlossnagle to Austin. They did an excellent job getting guys like Volantis, who was the best pitcher in baseball, in my opinion, this year, getting reliable arms. That really led them to losing, to be honest with you. But no credit to them. They had a fantastic regular season because of that pitching staff. If A&M is going to do anything next season, they have to solidify that pitching staff.
Yeah, of course they do. I think that of the names already entered in the portal, you're kind of trying to look at those guys who were kind of lighting it up at some so-called mid-majors. So a guy like Connor Madison over at Grand Canyon, he's a right-handed pitcher. I think there's a couple of names along those lines like Connor where you can kind of take a flyer on and say, hey, this is where we're at right now. We kind of we have some open positions, and we think that you'd be excellent to try and come in and just light it up. It's how it is now. So you're going to have to make these not necessarily offers, but these positions available and say, hey, we got people going to the MLB. We got people leaving out. We need to backfill. We need to have all these. You don't necessarily need all these closers, but you need these guys who can bring those middle innings together for sure. Especially like come in, maybe pitch 60, 70 pitches and kind of show their stuff, in my opinion.
Yeah, because you saw LSU kind of struggling with Arkansas Little Rock. Obviously, they won the game and they're off to the Super Regionals. Good for them. But that's my point, though. You see teams like that who I think they ended the season like 27-33. But some of the players they had just played with so much passion, so much confidence, and you can kind of pick and choose from teams like that of, you know what, this guy, he's playing at a mid-major. He wasn't highly recruited, but look how he plays. Look at his personality. Look how he can affect the locker room. And look at how he can be an immediate contributor for this team next season. No matter, because I'm going to be honest, we have seen this time and time again that these guys who aren't recruited, the equivalent of a 5-star football player in baseball, who, some of them do really well, and others, it takes time to develop, and then you get some of these smaller school guys. And like we saw with UTSA, these are a lot of, they had a couple guys from Italy on that team who just, it was international recruiting, and they just played harder and more strategic and just overall just better baseball than a Texas Longhorn team that a lot of people thought could contend for a championship this year. So you look at, I do believe that Early and every other coach right now is watching college baseball, watching all these smaller teams and bigger teams and kind of picking of certain guys who may enter the portal. Obviously, D1 baseball does a good job of keeping track of that. We do our best with who A&M is talking to, but it's a long road ahead. There's a lot going on.